Hey everyone, Tim Clapham here for the Maxon YouTube channel. I'm back with another tutorial for Cinema 4D, and this tutorial is going to be looking at the exchange feature, which allows us to transfer data between Cinema 4D and many other compositing applications. Now the app we're going to be specifically looking at is After Effects, and we're going to be looking at transferring information between Cinema 4D and After Effects. Now of course you can also transfer your camera and other information such as solids, nulls, etc. From After Effects to Cinema 4D, but that'll be something for another tutorial. So for this tutorial we're going to be looking specifically at traveling from Cinema 4D to After Effects, and it's going to be split into two parts. First of all, we're just going to have an introduction, look at how it works, and then we're going to look at a more slightly more advanced use of the kind of exchange. Now before we do this, you do need to make sure that first of all you have the correct plugin installed to use the exchange. What happens is Cinema 4D writes a file called an AEC file, and you need a plugin in After Effects to be able to read that file. Now if you go into your Cinema 4D installation directory, and I can show you here on a Mac, probably looks pretty similar on Windows 2, and in the folder where your application is, and this will be in your applications folder, so on here it's applications, Maxon, and then the folder. And we have this folder called Exchange Plugins. If you open this up, you can see we have folders for all the different applications. Now we're going to be working with After Effects. So you need to go into here, and we need to go into Importer, OS 10 Windows, and then you find the version of After Effects that you're working with. So I'm working with CS 5.5, so I'll go in here, and here we have a zip. If we unzip this, you can see we then end up with an After Effects plugin. Now this needs to be placed into your After Effects plugins folder. Okay, and here's the After Effects folder, and again this is just in my hard drive applications. And you can see in here we have a plugins folder, and if we open this up, I've already placed the Cinema 4D After Effects plugin inside here, but you need to just drag this into here. Now one thing you do need to be careful of is that you don't have more than one version of this plugin installed. If you do have more than one version, and especially if they're not the same version, the chances are it won't work correctly, and you'll try and import your AEC into After Effects and nothing will happen. So if you are having problems with nothing happening, that's quite common that people have more than one version installed. Now if you don't have the correct version in your Cinema 4D folder in the Exchange Plugins directory, if for some reason you're using an older version of Cinema 4D and you have a newer version of After Effects or something like that, and you don't have a compatible plugin in there, you can download this from the Maxon website. So what you need to do is you go to maxon.net. Once you've loaded maxon.net, simply come down to Downloads, Updates, click on Plugins, and here you can see we have all of the plugins for After Effects. So at the very top here is the latest version, which is compatible with After Effects CS3 through to CS 5.5 and Cinema 4D Release 13. But if you have an earlier version of Cinema 4D, Release 12, 11.5, 11, and an earlier version of After Effects, you can see that you can still access the different plugins down here. And they're all very similar, and all that's happened is that gradually Maxon, as they've developed the plugin, have added more features, and also as the applications have changed, they've adapted the plugin to make sure that everything still works as it should. Download this, install this into your After Effects plugins folder, restart After Effects, and then you should be good to go. Now we're not going to need that plugin just yet. We're going to use that later on. First of all, we need to build our scene before we can think about bringing it into After Effects, and of course we're going to have to render it. Now there is one other element that you're going to need to download, and there should be a link underneath this movie in YouTube. If not, you can visit hololux.com and you can find the scene file there. So what I've done is I've modeled an iPod, and you can see that what I've done is I've modeled the iPod Generation 5, and you might say, well, why didn't you model the more recent one? I just thought that this was more of an interesting shape, and this kind of suits what we're going to do a little bit more. We can use the colors on this to explore some of the MoGraph shaders. And this is a free model that I've made. It's certainly not perfect, but hopefully you guys can mess around with it and you find it useful. You can do whatever you want with it. There's no restrictions. You can use it commercially if you wish, anything you like. You can see that in the object manager I've left most of the objects either as parametric, extrude, lofts, and we've also got hypernerbs here, so we also have like the low res polygon cage, so you can see how I've modeled this, and you can use the hypernerbs to increase or decrease the smoothing as you feel you need to. I'm going to set this down to 1 just so everything's a little bit quicker. I've also made some basic materials. Now these aren't anything outstanding, but they're a fairly okay starting point for you to use, and you can check out how I've built those, and hopefully kind of reverse engineering those will be useful for you as well. Now, as well as making the model, I also sorted out the UVs, and if we open up something like the screen glass, you can see that we've got this iPod.psd. I've included the Photoshop file so that you can paint your own textures as well. And if we just have a quick look at this, the file is 4K, so there's a fair amount of resolution there. You probably won't need to keep it that large. You might not even want to do anything with it at all. As you can see at the top of the layer stack, we have a UV mesh layer, so you're going to want to switch that off for using it as a material. You probably don't want to render those, but that's handy to have as a reference if you want to paint on here or anything like that. Now, of course, you can open this into body paint and paint directly onto the model, or you can work on it in Photoshop. So let's just have a quick look what we've got here. So we've got the screen color, and you can see if we fold down these that I've left the elements, some of them are vector, and I've left them as smart objects. You can always open them up and edit the vectors as well. We've got a map for the screen. We've got the graphics for the wheel. Again, this is vector. And we've got some graphics for the back, and we're going to use these as mats, etc. Well, I've already set the materials up, but I'm just going to show you how I've set them up so that you can adapt them if you wish. You'll notice that I've kept everything in one file. Now, there's no need to necessarily do this. In fact, it's probably a good idea to split out your color and your bump and your diffuse maps, etc. But in this example, I've just kept them all in one file because it's simpler for the download, and you can actually access the individual layers within Cinema 4D anyway. If we close this down and come back over to Cinema 4D and we take a look at some of these materials, so you can see that they're all on layers. If we switch to iPod, and if we go to wheel graphics, for instance, and you can see that I've simply got a grey color in here, and then I've used the Photoshop file in the alpha. But if we click to open this up, you can see here we have a button for layer set, and if we click on this select button, it pops up with another dialog, and you can see here we have all the contents that are on the layers within the Photoshop file, and you can specifically choose one of these layer groups or an individual layer, and it will just use that layer in this channel of your material, so you don't have to split out all the elements as separate files, and it can just make things a little bit easier to organize when you have loads and loads of textures. And because all of these are pretty much black and white and they're just being used as mats, it kind of makes sense to build the textures that way. If we select the iPod body material, you can see that I've used a color shader instead of just choosing the color. Now, you don't necessarily need to do it that way. You can of course pick the color here, but the reason I've done it like this will become evident later when we work on the second section of this. I've also used things like layer shader, which works in a very similar way to layers within Photoshop, but it allows you to use layers within your materials, and you can then adjust the opacity and use composite modes, that kind of thing. And again, with reflection, I've used a layer shader. We've got some simple bumps, those kind of things. But there's nothing too complex here. These materials could certainly be improved, so hopefully that's something that you can take these and make some improvements. So that's the basic scene, and as I say, you need to download this, and we'll be using this iPod. And the first example, what we're going to do is pretty simple. We're just going to take this and we're going to imagine we're in a scene with some clients, and we're not sure exactly what we want on the screen of our iPod. So we're going to have this Cinema 4D logo on there for now, but we could always replace this with something else in After Effects. And we're also going to have a look at how we can kind of take the shadows and apply those over some alternative backgrounds in After Effects and also with reflections, and we're going to look at how we might grade the iPod into different colors without having to re-render. And this will cover the use of multipass, working with linear workflow, how to make sure that your After Effects and Cinema 4D projects are compatible when you use linear workflow. And as well as using multipass, we'll also be using the After Effects Exchange. So we'll be exporting out some 3D data such as the camera and the position of the screen so that we can switch the screen out in After Effects and replace it with other content. Okay, so this first example is going to be really simple animation. I'm not going to worry too much about the quality of the animation or the lighting or the render, etc. We're really interested in the kind of exchange between Cinema 4D and After Effects. If you want to do your own animation and take the same principle into your own projects, then that's awesome. That's exactly the point of this tutorial. But let's just add some animation anyway so that we have something to work with. However, before we do that, we should make sure we have our project set up correctly. So I'm just going to press Command or Control D to bring up my project settings, and here you can see that I'm working at 25 frames a second. I have my document set from 0 to 49, so we've got 50 frames, so it's only 2 seconds, pretty quick, so it should render fairly quickly. And if we come into render settings, output, you can see that I'm just going to render at 1280 by 720 and all frames. Okay, and we'll come back in and do a little bit more exploration within our render settings later on. You can see that it's set to physical render, but whether you use physical or standard, whether you're using R13 or R12, it really doesn't make any difference. Everything that we cover within this tutorial will still apply. Switch back to the editor view. Let's add in a floor object. I'm also going to add in a null, call this cam null, and I'm going to hold down shift and add in a camera, and holding down shift will make that camera a child of the selected object. So with this camera selected, I'm just going to reset position and rotation. I've got a script that does that. Okay, and now what I want to do is start with the camera just focused on the screen, and then have the camera pull back, and at the same time move to one side with the iPod spinning around as if it was the kind of end frame or the end sequence of an ad. Pretty basic stuff. So let's first of all make this the active camera. And I'm going to take the camera back, say -70, and let's grab the null and pull this up. And we just want to be framing the screen, so somewhere like there. So I've got the null on Y73 and the camera on -70 for position Z. Now I'm going to add a key for my camera on position Z, and I'm going to select the null and add a key for the Y position. I'm also going to add a key for the null X position. So the camera can pull back, and at the same time the null can move across and up. Now you could do all this move on the camera, but I tend to use this kind of system of nested nulls for camera animation quite often, because when you get some kind of more complex camera moves, it can make some of them a little bit easier to manage. Okay, now let's move to the end of our project, 49. Select the camera, and we need to pull this camera out so we can see the whole of our iPod. So I'm going to set the Z position here to be something like around here, maybe a bit further. Let's say -250. Let's add in another key, and of course we need to grab our null and move this down a little bit so that our iPod is a bit more central, somewhere around here. Maybe we could make it a little bit lower, something like 45, and let's move it across as well. Say somewhere around here, say 45 there as well. Nice. Okay, so if we just select these two parameters, and we can add a key for those. And now if we rewind and just scrub through, you can see it's some awesome piece of animation. Okay, let's select the iPod, and I'm going to add some animation for the heading. So let's just leave that at 0 for frame 0. Jump to the end, and I just want it to do one complete spin. I'm going to set this to -360 and add another key. So now if we scrub through, you can see the iPod kind of spins around, lands back in place. I'm just going to press Shift V to bring up my viewport controls, and under display uncheck selected wireframe just so that everything looks a bit clearer. I tend to switch that on and off all the time when I'm working, so I don't really want to see the wireframe of the objects when I'm animating, but when I'm modeling I mostly do. Okay, so that's looking okay for what we want. We can come in and tweak our F-curves. Let's just open up the timeline, fold these down so we can see all the different tracks. So I want it to kind of really ease in at the end and spin quite fast. So if we select our rotation H track and we can press Control and then tap space, and if you hold down Control, if you just tap space, it will switch between F-curve and key mode. But if you actually hold down Control, whatever you have selected as keys will stay selected and become visible as your F-curve. So that's quite handy to switch between key and F-curve mode and keep the same selection. And there you go. So I'm going to just select this first key and just pull this handle right down like so. So now that we have like quite a fast spin, and then it sort of slides into space. As I say, nothing too groundbreaking with this animation. I'm just going to do the same kind of thing with the camera position Z, so that it sort of zooms back a lot quicker, and also with the camera null. If we select those and press H, it will frame the selected curves. We can then simply adjust these keys. And there we go. So you can see now it sort of zooms back a little bit quicker and eases into its final resting place. And at this point you could have some type that comes out or something like that. It's entirely up to you. You could even place a null object or something in Cinema 4D in 3D space and use 3D type in After Effects using the export that I'm about to show you to animate your text that way. Okay, pretty basic stuff. I'm going to come up and save this. Let's make this scene a little bit more interesting. Let's add some lights and reflection, and we'll add a little bit of an environment. So pretty quick stuff. Really keen to move on to the second section, but it's important to show all the different features of the After Effects Exchange. Come up to the scene menu. I'm going to add in a regular sky object. I want this sky object to be used purely for kind of reflections and refractions, so I don't want it to be seen by camera, and to do that we can simply add a Cinema 4D compositing tag, and under the tag tab we can uncheck seen by camera. So now this sky object will only be seen by rays or by global illumination, which means basically that we can reflect it in our objects, but it won't get seen in the main render. We're going to want something to reflect other than the basic kind of grey or white default sky surface. So I'm going to create a new material. I'm just going to go to the no layer, and I'm going to call this HDR. And because we're using the sky object, it's a special type of object, so you can add your HDRI to the color channel or the luminance channel. If you're using a really large sphere, it's quite important that you add it to the luminance channel, but because of the sky it's an infinite size anyway, it doesn't really make any difference. So I'm just going to add an HDR into the color channel. Now you should have had an HDR included when you downloaded the iPod, but of course you're free to use an HDR of your own. So I've added the HDR backyard blurred. It's pretty low res. I kept it small just so that I can include it with the download. But we're only using it for reflection, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. So I'm just going to grab this and drop it onto this sky object. And if we render now, it's just going to load the images in. Okay, so you may or may not see any of that reflection at all there, but hopefully there's a little bit of reflection going on there. One thing I want to do with this HDR is actually just drop that into a filter shader, and the reason for that is because I can open that up and I can just reduce the saturation down. I don't want any of the color from that HDR. I just want the dynamic range, so we get some quite bright highlights and that kind of thing. Next I'm going to add a material to the floor, so I'm just going to double click again and let's call this floor. Okay, I'm going to set the value to 100. Let's switch to basic, uncheck specular, and I'm just going to add in reflection. So I want it to have like a blurry reflection of the iPod. So switch to the reflection tab. I don't really need it to be 100, but using the technique that we're going to have, you can adjust the reflection in post anyway. But let's just set that to be, say, 50, and I'm going to set the blurriness to be around 15, something like so. Now, blurry reflections are fairly slow, and depending on whether you're using the physical or standard renderer, determines how you control that. If we just quickly switch to the standard renderer, hold on, let's just pull this down so you can see the controls. You can see that the minimum samples, maximum samples, and accuracy is all grayed out. We can't change those. That's because I'm using the physical render. If I set that to standard, you can see that we can then access these. Now, you know, you can probably get away with reducing the maximum samples down to 64, or even 32 maybe. It will start to look a little bit noisy, and you can probably reduce the accuracy down to like 20 as well. I always find that you can have the accuracy fairly low, and it's more important to sort of keep the samples a little bit higher so that there's less grain, and it's a little bit inaccurate, but that doesn't matter so much. So I normally would, with the old standard renderer, would probably set these at like 1 and 8 and an accuracy of 10 or something crazy low like that for all my test renders. And then when I do my, you know, renders for the actual project, I would probably set them higher, sort of like minimum of 8, maximum of like 64, maybe 128. Really depends on the res that I'm outputting and the final delivery, and maybe set the accuracy up to like 20, 25. So still pretty low settings, but you find that it will render a hell of a lot quicker. If you're using the physical renderer, you come into here and you can adjust the blurriness here for things like, you know, blurry reflections and transparency, and that will affect all materials. So you kind of can control it all from one place. So it's a, you know, it's a huge advantage with the physical renderer that you don't have with the standard renderer. On the standard renderer, you have to adjust it on each material, but you can always set up some espresso to like control all of those through one slider or something like that. When I'm working with the physical renderer, I tend to set the sampling quality to automatic, and you can get really good results just using this automatic mode. And all you need to do is adjust the shading error threshold, and 9 times out of 10, that will give you the result that you want. So if it's like test renders now, I would set this, say 60, maybe even as high as 80, and I'll probably set my blurriness down to 1 or even lower. And I've done that the same for my shadows, so that's area shadows, and also for any ambient occlusion. Of course, when I output the render that I want to use in my project, I will reduce this threshold down, and I will increase the subdivision of the blurriness, but I will keep that as low as possible, and you can increase this to say 2, 2.1, 2.2, or even, you know, 3 or higher. But obviously the higher you get, the slower the render is going to be. So it's well worth rendering individual frames and just kind of tinkering in here, you know, for half an hour or so before you commit to your overnight or your few days render, because you can save hours and hours of render time if you've got to render hundreds of frames just by setting this to say 2.3 instead of 2.5, those kind of things. Okay, so we've got this really low now, and I can drag my floor material onto the floor, and if we render, you can see that it renders fairly quickly, but you can see also that obviously it's pretty noisy, and that's because I've set those settings so low. But this gives us a result, and you can see the render time down here is around a minute, a second should I say. If it was a minute, it would be a bit worrying. So it's about a second, so you know that's really good for just doing test renders, and obviously we'll bump that up when we output the render we're going to use in After Effects. Right, so I just want to check on this material under color that I set the color to be pure white. Yeah, it's, you know, it's pretty high, pure white, value 100. But we're going to be replacing the background anyway. I'm just using this to catch the reflections, and we're going to catch the shadows as well. And then we'll take the shadow and reflections and we'll use those in After Effects and drop them over a different background. I'm going to add some lights into here now, but before I do that, I just want to do a little bit of scene management. I advise this on any of you that work in Cinema 4D. Get in the habit of this, because if you're working with complicated scenes with lots of objects, as soon as you start managing your scenes better, when you come back to it in 6 months, it will, you'll be glad you did. I've got the layers, the layer manager down here, and you can fold those just by pressing Control and clicking on that little grey dot, and you can just hide things in your layout, which is pretty handy. You can see I've already got some layers set up in here, but of course you just go File, New Layer, or you can double click And I'm going to add in a null. I'm just going to call this scene. And I'm going to take my sky and drop that in there, and I'm going to take my floor and drop that in there. And let's just put this at the bottom. And now I want to add all of these elements to my scene layer. So I'm just going to hold this, drag it onto the scene layer, but hold down Control. And if we hold down Control, it will add all of those elements onto that layer. That means I can just solo that if I want to, or I can just solo the iPod, or I can switch the visibility off, or I can hide it in the managers, those kind of things. So when you've got really, really heavy scenes and they're playing back really slowly, simply use layers, and you can then solo your different elements, and it will play back much quicker, and it will make your whole workflow much more efficient.